Welcome to Sparked by VinoVonk, the podcast where we uncork the stories behind exceptional wines and today sparkling wines. I'm Jeroen and today we're raising the glass to English sparkling wines and we're going to Kent to explore Gusbourne, one of the pioneers putting English sparkling wines firmly on the world map. My guest is Laura Rhys from Gusbourne and we're tasting through 4 exceptional wines from their range. 2019, a Brut Reserve, the Rosé, Blanc, and the Blanc Noir from 2018. And if you ever wondered why, what makes English sparkling wine so special and why critics compare it to champagne, this conversation will give you all the answers. We'll talk about terroir, winemaking philosophy, challenges producing wine in England, and what it takes to create world-class bubbles in a relatively young region. So let's dive into the world of Gusbourne and welcome Laura.
Hi.
Hi, Laura. Thank you very much for your time and thank you very much for organizing this. I got 4 exceptional bottles of Gusbourne and I got them through your Dutch importer, Vineyards.
Yes.
So Vineyards, thank you very much for sending these bottles. But first of all, Laura, who is Laura and how did you become what you do at Gusbourne?
Okay. So I studied hospitality at university and through that, I discovered the WSET courses and started learning about wine. And then when I graduated university, I started working as a sommelier in the UK and worked with some really amazing sommeliers, very inspirational as well. And so because of that, I also, at the same time as working, started to look at competitions and exams and that kind of thing. And throughout the 12 years that I was a sommelier, I was always very excited about English wine and about the prospect and the promise, I think, of English wine. And, you know, it's a young industry. It's an industry in a cool climate. And it's certainly an industry with challenges. And it's also an industry which has grown just so much over the last even 20 years. And so when I first started as a sommelier, sometimes it was quite difficult to introduce people to English sparkling wine, but that's not the case anymore. And I always remember I was working as a head sommelier in a Michelin-starred restaurant in London, and I tasted Gusbourne. And I just was so completely blown away by the style, by the quality of the wine. And so started chatting to them and then started to work for them 10 years ago. So I joined Gusbourne in 2015, and now my role is both ambassadorial in the sense that I am in charge of all the ambassadorial programs, I suppose, throughout our export markets and in the UK.
So you work in Gusbourne and you are a global ambassador.
Yes.
But you told me about your sommelier, but you're not a standard sommelier because I found out you're a master sommelier.
Yes, I am.
And there are only like 200 master sommeliers in the world.
Yeah, I think there's closer to 300 now, but yes, yeah.
300. It's like the equivalent of master of wine, but a master of wine knows a lot about wine, but a master of sommelier knows a lot about beverages, about drinks. It's not only about wine.
Yeah, and you know, there's a lot of correlations in some regards between Master of Wine and Master Sommelier, and then there's a lot of differences as well. And I think probably one of the most striking differences is that the Master Sommelier qualification, the diploma, focuses much more on the role of a sommelier. So all of the exams are focused much more towards service and towards the job of a sommelier, as well as all of the knowledge aspect. And so the blind tasting is spoken instead of written. We all, of course, have the I'm so sorry. We of course have the practical exam as well, which is a large part of the exam. But yeah, it's an amazing. It was an amazing process to go through. The people I met and the things I learned, and it's really lovely now to be able to be on the other side and to be able to give back to people who are studying for it now. So.
Yeah. So beside the WSET courses you did, you also did the Master Sommelier. So you know about how it's done working in a restaurant, even in Michelin-starred restaurants on a very high level, working with exceptional wines. And now you're representing and working at one of in the UK biggest sparkling wine makers. And how is it to combine that knowledge and bring it into practicality?
Yeah, I mean it's great. When I joined Gusbourne, I was hugely excited to be able to dive a little bit deeper into the producer side of things as well. And so I'm very fortunate that I can work quite closely with our winemakers, so Mary and her team. And so for all of the base wine grading and the base wine blending prior to the second fermentation, I am I'm involved in that, which is great. And, you know, over the last 10 years, I've learned a huge amount. But also I think it's really interesting because um, winemakers and sommeliers taste in very different ways. They come to it from a very different position. And so I think it's really exciting to be able to blend that and to be able to see it from the winemaking perspective as well as the, I guess, you know, the perspective of seeing those bottles once they finish their journey on a wine list and on a restaurant table, or, you know, on our tables at home. So
Yeah. And how do you compare the winemaking process in different? Is it very much different, like making a wine for a customer?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
So
Sorry.
is it is there a huge gap between, okay, we're making a wine because we can make it, or is there also the possibility to make a wine that suits like it's more accessible to a large audience?
Okay, yes. Yeah, I think, you know, it's all a balance. And um, uh, any winemaker will always be thinking about who's going to be drinking the wine when, you know, when they've made it. And it's no different at Gusbourne. And I think that's a really kind of natural way. And I'm sure it's the same for many different winemakers that, you know, when we work in the wine industry, we develop a sort of palate that likes a certain style of wine. And I think it's about recognizing that and then also thinking about kind of finding that balance, so that the wines are still accessible. So yeah.
Yeah, and talking about Gusbourne, it's a very young company if you compare it to other wine companies or sparkling wine companies. But when was it founded?
So we planted our first vines in 2004. And then our first vintage was in 2006. So we're just coming up to, 20 years since our first vintage, which is hugely exciting.
Yeah, and just a curious question: you have almost 20 years history. When will the 2026 vintage will be launched? Because that's a very special vintage.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Um, well, I mean, we need to have the vintage first. So let's see.
Yeah.
Um, let's see what next summer is like. But I suppose, if all goes well, then the grapes will be harvested September, October time next year. Fast fermentation. And of course, if you go to the winery now, all the wine is in tank and barrel and waiting to be blended. So blending normally happens in the spring the following year, and then bottling in the early summer. And then let's say 3 years on lees. So I would say probably at least 2030.
Well, mark your calendars. Put it in your agenda. 2030, the 20 years anniversary of Gusbourne will be celebrated, if all go well. But we'll see. It's good to have something in the future, of course. And what is the vision about behind Gusbourne?
So when Andrew planted those first vines in 2004, his vision was to make world-class wine. He wanted to make some of the best wines in the UK, but also some of the best wines that could really stand up against some of the best wines being produced around the world. And so, right from the word go, everything that Andrew did and that we carry on every day as well is how we can do everything in the best possible way, without compromising on quality. And so that's always been our vision ultimately. And so to that end, we don't ever buy fruit. All of our fruit is estate grown. It all comes from our own vineyards. And also we only ever produce vintage wine. So we don't make anything that's non-vintage at all. And I think that's really important for us, at least, because we want to celebrate our vineyards and really, I think, showcase a snapshot of time in a sense of where these grapes came from and in which year. And it's been so fascinating over the last 2 decades to look at these vintages, each of them different, and yet each of them with something kind of special and with a Gusbourne feel to the wines. But it's lovely now to be able to go back along those vintages and look at, I don't know, warmer years or cooler years and how they age and how they develop, which is great. So
Yeah, because for people who don't know it yet, in Champagne, the most known area region that makes sparkling wine, they use assemblage. They blend different kind of years with a vintage champagne. Like for now, they making. We're now in 2025. They make wines from champagnes from 2025 and reserve wines from other years. And it's very special in that area when they make a vintage wine. They make wine from grapes from that year and nothing else. And that is your signature. You only use grapes from 1 year. So it's what they think in Champagne, it's very special. We do it, they only do it in exceptional years. That's your signature. You only do that. You only make wines from 1 year, from grapes from 1 year. And
yes.
what is that? Why do you have that philosophy? Because you could also think, okay, they do it in Champagne. They could do it for a reason. Well, let's do it also.
Yeah. Well, when we first started making wine, we didn't really have the opportunity to make a non-vintage or a multi-vintage blend because we planted 4 hectares the first year, and I think a similar amount the second year and the third year, and we've sort of grown gradually. And so those very first years, we didn't really have wine that we could afford to set aside. So it was naturally, anyway, a single vintage wine. And I think as the years carried on, we noticed how special I think the wines were and how special the vineyards were, and we wanted to keep highlighting that every year, I think. So so that's not to say that the conversation of non-vintage hasn't come up with, shall we, shan't we, but we've always decided to stay single vintage. It's for us, I think, just makes the wines very special. So
yeah, because it's not like it's not a choice by the terroir in England, because there are also other sparkling wine makers in England. Very well known is also Night Timber.
Yes.
What is the main difference between Gusbourne and Night Timber in your opinion?
Well, certainly, I mean, Night Timber, they do single vintage wines, but their kind of classic cuvée is non-vintage. So I suppose we're different in that sense. They have vineyards in Sussex and Hampshire and Kent, and I think we're much more firmly based towards Kent in terms of our of where our vineyards are. Um, but we also have similarities. I mean, certainly, the terroir in some regards is quite similar. That the grape varieties that we're using, of course, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, we're using that, and so I think stylistically, certainly there's differences, but some similarities too, I think.
Yeah, and you were only focusing on Kent, but why only on Kent?
So our first vineyards were in Kent, and they're very coastal vineyards. They're 6 miles inland from the coast, from the English Channel. So really in the warmest, driest corner of the UK, really, that southeastern bit, and the coastal climate and the maritime influence is really beneficial for us in terms of how it moderates the climate and helps with frost risk. The vineyards are really low down, so they're 40 meters above sea level. I think we're all quite familiar with low elevation, but that really helps to capture warmth as well. And we have clay and sand soils in Kent. And I think having that kind of richer clay gives lovely ripeness and lovely weight and intensity to the wines, which I think is great. And 10 years later, we then took on some vineyard land in Sussex, but still the majority of our fruit comes from Kent. So you have two sort of quite different terroirs, I suppose. Kent, obviously clay and sand and lovely ripeness coming from the fruit. And then our vineyards that we have in Sussex are on chalk, and they're higher in elevation. And there's more sort of kind of racy acidity and more precision, I think, in the Sussex fruit. And then the weight and the generosity comes from the Kent fruit. And I think it's the Kent site that probably marks Gusbourne's style in terms of the style of wine that we make, which, they tend to be slightly more generous, more rounded, kind of richer in style. And I think a lot of that is because of those really special vineyards with clay in Kent. So.
Yeah, and if you compare the terroir from Kent and Sussex into like the terroir of Champagne, are there a lot of similarities or is it completely different?
No, I mean, there's similarities. If you look at the soil structure, we're both regions are within what we call the Paris Basin, which is the geological kind of soil structure. And it's shaped like an oval, goes north to south. And the northern tip is in the southeast of England, and the southern tip encapsulates regions like Champagne, the north of Burgundy, the east of the Loire Valley. So that whole kind of soil system underneath is very similar. I think climatically we're quite different. Certainly we're cooler than Champagne, but also probably more maritime in terms of our influence. But so there's similarities and differences, which is nice. And I think you see that in the wines as well. I think a lot of producers in the UK absolutely took inspiration from Champagne, both in terms of style, but also in terms of quality as well. And, what we were all aspiring to was the quality and the style of Champagne. But what's really interesting is over the last 10 20 years to see the development of the industry in the UK and to see, I think, the emergence of a style of English sparkling wine. And, you can put them side by side, champagne and sparkling, and you'll see, champagne and English sparkling, and you'll see a lot of similarities, but I think sometimes you can also pick out some differences too.
And what are the main differences for you?
I think, well, it's hard to generalize because there's so many producers in Champagne and so many producers in England. And so it's hard to put it into just one sentence. But I do think that the acidity is different in English sparkling wine to Champagne. And also, I wonder if the fruit profile feels more kind of lifted in English wines. You get all of that like super intense citrus, green apple fruit. And I sometimes notice that maybe it takes a bit longer for English wines to show some of those more autolytic characters. And whether or not that's to do with, I don't know. I don't know what it's to do with, but sometimes I feel that. And, these wines major on the fruit perhaps for a little bit longer.
Maybe it's all about temperature, because like 20, 25, maybe 30 years ago, the temperature and the climate was how it's now in Kent or southern England, was in Champagne. So like maybe you are 25 years behind of the climate in Champagne. A lot of people tell that, okay, the climatal conditions in southern England are like the climatal conditions like 25, 30 years ago in Champagne. Well, I don't know, but what do you think?
Well, I think if you look at average temperatures, then it's easy to say that the average temperature we have now in the UK is similar to the average temperatures that they had in Champagne kind of 30 or 40 years ago. That I think we can say for sure. In terms of where we go from here, I don't know. That's a little bit more uncertain, isn't it? Because I think none of us quite know what's happening to the climate. But I think what we can certainly see in the UK and at Gusbourne as well is that even in 20 years, there's been a shift in terms of average temperatures within our vineyards and the ripeness of the fruit within our vineyards as well. So, it's certainly positive in one way, but it also, I think, brings with it a lot of unpredictability in the weather. And I think, we're all seeing that. So it's about finding that balance, I think, really.
Yeah. So you're already finding that the moment of harvesting is getting earlier every year. You have to harvest earlier because the fruit is ripe already.
Yeah, not earlier every year, actually. If you looked at it on an average, then you would say that it was getting earlier. But if you took 5 years in a row, it wouldn't be a standard, because you still have cooler years and warmer years. And sometimes you'll still have years where, it was a warm summer, but not a particularly early harvest. And so it's really interesting to see. But yes, I think if you tracked it on a chart, then that it's certainly on average getting warmer. And if you looked, I don't know, if you looked in the first decade that we were producing, I think we harvested more times in October than we did in September. And then if you look at the second decade, I think we harvested more times in September than in October. But then in 2024, which of course is, only last year, we were harvesting towards the very back end of October, nearly November. So it doesn't always doesn't always track. But.
No. And talking about vineyards, You talked about what kind of grape varieties you use. You use Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Meunier, or Pinot
Yeah.
Meunier, the same main grape varieties from Champagne. But
Yeah.
do you also use the same clones as they use in Champagne or other parts of France? Or
So in our vineyards, we've got about 40 different clones. And they're split in the majority between Burgundy clones and Champagne clones. The Champagne clones are great for sparkling wine, and the Burgundy clones are also really exciting for sparkling wine. They tend to yield a bit lower, so you have a bit more intensity, a bit more weight, a bit more ripeness as well. But also it allows us, although we're tasting the sparkling wines here today, because we have Burgundian clones, it also allows us to make tiny parcels of still wines as well, which is really exciting.
so you also make still wines.
We do, yeah.
Like in Champagne, they also make still wines. It's like called Champagne. No, Ah, how do they call it
It's
there?
called,
Ch-
um,
Coteau
oh my
Champenoise.
gosh, Coteau Champenois.
Yeah, Coteau
Coteau,
Champenoise. Yeah.
yeah,
So, like in Champagne, they call it Coteau Champenoise. But how do
yes.
you call it in England?
We just call it Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
Yeah, yeah. It's so simple.
It
Because
is.
but what I found very interesting, because uh, it's like it's not English champagne, because champagne is a very strict regulation. You call it English sparkling wine, but a
Mm-hmm,
lot of similarities are on the bottles. Like uh, you call it Brut Reserve, and you
mm-hmm.
call it Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir. Is that because of the terms that people know these kind of terms of wines?
Yeah, I think it probably is. I think that Blanc de Blanc, for example, and Blanc de Noir are terms which you can find around the world. So yes, of course, champagne and English sparkling wine, but also you can find it on a Tasmanian sparkling or maybe a sparkling wine from the US as well. So it has become, I think, a very universal term um, when we talk about yeah, Blanc de Blanc, so wines made only from Chardonnay or from white grapes, for example, and so we decided to adopt that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe also in the Netherlands they make Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir. I have to do some research of it. But the last question about the vineyards and how you work. Do you work organically? Do you work sustainable? How does it? How do you work?
We're one of the founding members of the Wines of Great Britain Sustainability Initiative. And we do take sustainability very seriously. So, from all aspects, yes, in the vineyards, but also in the winery as well, in terms of water consumption and looking at packaging and all of the different ways in which we can consume less ultimately. In terms of the vineyards, we are not organic. So we're not certified as organic or biodynamic. Unfortunately, in the UK, it's just so hard um, to be organic with the amount of moisture that we have. But that being said, John, who's our vineyard manager, and he planted the first vines back in 2004. So he's been with us for our whole journey. And his um, um, his feeling is always about how we can preserve the long-term health of the vine and of the vineyard. So, it's not only about what we can do this year, but also what we can do next year and the year after and the year after to get the best health in the vine, and then ultimately the best quality fruit too. And so he's done a lot of work with the biome of the soil and all of the fungi and how that all interacts. And I know he's a great fan of learning more about regenerative farming and everything that goes with that. So We will look at wildflower meadows, for example, and we want to use our additional planting, so our sort of non-vine planting, in ways that can allow us to get the best from the land. So whether or not that's from a soil nutrition perspective, or from, I don't know, the perspective of allowing good insects in to get rid of the bad insects, to mean that we don't need to spray as much, for example. So there's
Yeah,
lots that
it's
we
all
can
about
do.
balance. It's a whole
Yeah,
ecosystem.
yeah, for sure. And that's exactly it. And I think it's about preserving that whole ecosystem. So, we'll have sheep that come into the vineyard in the winter from a local farmer. And it means that the local farmer now doesn't need to put his sheep. He was driving his sheep 200 miles to give them winter, winter grass grazing. And now he brings them to us. It's great for us because it keeps the grass cut. They're great natural fertilizers as well. So it works well. But yes, so there's lots
And
that
he,
we can try.
and he doesn't have to drive the sheep for 200 miles.
Yes, I'm pretty sure it was 200 miles.
Yeah.
Either way, it was a long way. So
It was a long way. It's better for the sheep also, because the sheep
yes,
can walk and they don't have to get in a big truck, because they wouldn't walk 200 miles.
very true.
Shall we? I have some wines brought by Roos from Vineyards. A big shout out to Roos for sending or delivering these bottles to me.
Yeah,
You
she
don't
was
have the
great.
bottles with you? Yeah. I will pour in the first wine. It's the Brut Reserve 2019.
Great.
Could you tell me something about it?
Sure. So Brut Reserve is a wine that we make every year. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm losing my voice. The Brut Reserve is a wine that we make every year, and it's always a blend. So it's always a blend of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. And in 19, it was 62% Chardonnay, 28% Pinot Noir, and 10% Pinot Meunier. And when we blend for Brut Reserve, we're always looking for, I guess, perhaps a softer, more fruit-driven, more round styles of base wine. So in this vintage, it's quite heavily dominated by Chardonnay, but that will change year by year because we're blending, of course, every year, and every year the base wines are different. So in 19, it was quite heavily dominated by Chardonnay, and I think on the nose you get a lot of that kind of citrus, green apple, orchard fruit, but also underneath that there's more kind of red apple or apple skin, or kind of peach, apricot, stone fruit characters coming through too.
Yeah, and a lot of richness.
Yes.
The main thing I think I got is like an oaked Chardonnay.
Oh,
But
okay.
do you
Yeah.
use oak in it or not? Is it is just the richness?
I think it's a bit of both. So we do use a little bit of oak here in all of our wines when we're blending. The kind of backbone of the blend is from stainless steel fermented base wines, but we will always add in a little bit of oak. And I think normally it's the kind of 8 to 12% oak, and a lot of that can be old oak as well, because what we want from the oak is more from a mouthfeel perspective rather than from a very flavour perspective. But the 19 vintage will have had probably about 3 years on lees, and now it's had some more time on cork as well. And I think that time post disgorgement on cork also helps to bring kind of that really sort of toasted, more nutty, more autolytic character as well.
Yeah, so in that way you have the flexibility, because the regulation doesn't say, okay, you have to have like 3 years on lease. The regulation is like the same as in Champagne, like 15 months on the second fermentation for English sparkling wines.
No, it's 9 months.
9 months? Oh,
It's 9 months.
and 9 months. You do a minimum of 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, Brut Reserve, it depends on the vintage. So um, sometimes we might release it with maybe 2.5, just under 2.5 years. But then every vintage will be slightly different because it's about when the wine is ready. And also, we don't disgorge everything all at once. So when we release a wine versus kind of the last disgorging of that wine could have, I guess, 6 or 9 months more on lees.
Perfect. And after the disgorgement, what I learned also at my champagne specialist course, and it's also suitable here, of course, is that you develop more autolysis characters because you have like the Maillard effect of the Chardonnay.
Yeah.
But you also have a lot of more balance. And one time I had a conversation with a champagne maker. He said like when you do the disgorgement, it's like if a bottle of champagne was a human, you cut off an arm and you have to recover because you don't live anymore without, you live without an arm. And is that the same philosophy of Gusbourne, waiting a couple of months more before releasing after the disgorgement?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's absolutely right. It takes a little bit of time for the wine to recover post disgorging. So I think we try to aim for at least 3 months pre-release.
I tasted it. I already knew Gusbourne and I already loved it. But what I found very interesting is it's very rich, very full. You have a lot of flavor, aromas, but it's not too complex. It's very accessible. And at the same time, you have different layers of acidity. And the layers of acidity are like knives between the rich aromas. And at the same time, they're like a shaker, shaking everything up, making it a very nice balance.
Yes.
And it's not your typical standard basic sparkling wine. It's very serious, but at the same time, I have a little bit of a sea breeze, and it's a little bit lighter than a tropical flavor, but it's not as warm as a champagne. It's different, but at the same time, the effervescence, the mousse, the bubbles are integrated, and it's on one side it's completely different, and at the other side it's the same. How do you explain that?
I think, um, I think a lot of it is down to terroir. I think that is down to where the grapes are grown, but also the winemaking philosophy as well. We look for ripeness in the fruit and really kind of solid flavor development. And yet at the same time, we're in the UK, so we have that kind of natural high acid, which is great. And then when you look at the blending process, and we'll blend these base wines together to create the kind of wine that we want from Brut Reserve or Blanc de Blanc or any of the others. And then add in the lees aging and ultimately the cork aging. I think that's when you get this really nice balance between, yes, richness of fruit, some more complexity, but also that acid profile coming from the fact that, yeah, it's grown in a cool climate ultimately.
Yeah, but it's not as you think. Okay, it's very high in acidity. It's like a vinegar. It's higher in acidity, but it's still a sparkling wine that's with a lot of richness. So it's rich and high in acidity at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, what we find is that the acidity, yes, it's present, but it's very friendly. And I think what it does is just add that little bit of freshness, I think, to the richness. So
I will
great.
go into the rosé then. And the rosé and sorry?
No, I was going to say, if you wanted to save the rosé till last, then it might be nice as a final glass, perhaps, but not to disrupt your tasting order.
No, you're not disrupting. I'm just adapting it. And should I start with the Blanc and Blanc or
Yeah,
with the
that's
Blanc and
nice.
Noir?
Let's go for Blanc de Blanc. Sounds good.
Okay, so this is a Blanc and Blanc 2018,
Yes.
100% Chardonnay, I guess, because you work with Pinot Noir. Is a red, blue, red variety. Meunier also.
Yep.
And how do you make this?
So Blanc de Blanc, of course, 100% Chardonnay. And then when we blend the base wines for Blanc de Blanc, we're looking for the particular base wines that have the most precision, the most elegance. We want to really highlight, I think, the kind of citrus, green apple, orchard fruit notes. And, unlike the Brut Reserve that you just tasted, the Blanc de Blanc on the nose feels probably, a little bit more lemon citrus rather than orange citrus, a little more more mineral driven. The apple notes are really kind of green apple rather than red apple, and then you have this really kind of whetstone, salty mineral character, which then carries on throughout the palate as well.
Yeah, it's also a little bit like a lemon curd pie, and with marzipan. So you have the almonds and the sweetness and the roundness and the richness.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
But at the same time, the flintiness, the saline, the minerality, the saltiness. It's like a sea breeze is coming through it.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
So we do try to intentionally pick some of these base wines which have that really lovely minerality and that kind of salty sea breeze note as well.
And it's lovely again. But the mousse is more calmed down, like the 2019. And it's very rich, very round, very nice structured. Normally, a Blanc de Blanc from the famous area in France, Champagne, for me is a little bit, the effervescent, the mousse is a little bit too shy.
Okay.
And it's like, it's a little bit, the mousse is like when you open a bottle of Coca-Cola for after 1 week. That kind of experience. It's a little bit off, but this one is very present in a very nice way and giving it more aromas, more, it pops very nice in your mouth. And all the aromas and all the flavors. But I also have a lot of spiciness in it. Spices like cardamom, cinnamon, Asian spices. And
yes.
Yeah, that's not why I think, okay, it's cool climate. I don't think about spices.
It's true. So often in the Blanc de Blanc, we'll pick up maybe some spice, but you're right. I think a lot of that kind of sweeter spice is coming from the vintage. And 18 was a very warm vintage. And so the ripeness levels that we saw in 18, I guess, versus 19 were different. And I think the intensity of the ripeness in 18 was really pronounced. And so because of that, that's where I think perhaps, we're talking about lemons, but it's lemon curd or it's kind of that marzipan note because there's so much richness in the fruit because it was a lovely warm vintage. So,
yeah. Oh, it's amazing. But how do you make the selection between, okay, this, because you have different vineyards, different plots, do you make a selection of the plots and do you vinify it by themselves and do you select them, okay, this will be one in the Brut Reserve, this is one of the Blanc de Blanc?
Yes.
Or
Yes. No, exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. So, within the vineyards and the, I don't know, 40 odd clones that we have, and different root stocks as well, then we'll pick the blocks separately, vinify them separately. And it means that when we're blending, we're probably working with somewhere around 200 different base wines for any given vintage. And so that's how we can then set aside particular styles of base wines for the different cuvées.
so for the Blanc de Blanc, you you make a selection of 200 base wines, but
Well, for
how do
all
you
of the
make
wines.
this?
Yeah.
Yeah, for all of the wines, but how do you make the selection? Okay, this will be pure Chardonnay.
Because I think it's about the structure. So when you have each of these base wines, and we might have, so we taste them in different flights, and so we might have a flight of 6 wines, and it'll be 6 different Chardonnays, and they'll be from different parts of the vineyard with different clones, but they'll all taste different. They'll all have different structure, different flavor profile, different length. And so when we say, okay, this is for Blanc de Blanc, then the base wines need to have a bit more um, uh, not length, because it's not as straightforward as that, but they need this line of structure running through. And so if you imagine that perhaps a base wine for Brut Reserve might finish on the palate and feel round, then a base wine for Blanc de Blanc might finish on the palate and feel like it finishes in a point, if that makes sense. And so it's structurally and flavor profile. The wines there are different. And also Blanc de Blanc ultimately, I think, is made as a wine to age longer than Brut Reserve. And so that has an effect in terms of what we decide to blend.
Yeah, and what is your role in that blending process? Are you part of the tasting team?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Mary, our head winemaker, heads it all up. And generally Mary, her assistant, Joe, AJ, who's head of operations, and myself, we'll all 4 of us sit down and grade all of the base wines. And during that grading process, we'll look at structure and flavor profile and how these wines fit into the different blends. And then that kind of starts the process. And then Mary and Joe and the winemaking team will take that away and they'll look at prospective blends. And then sometimes I'll come in and taste some of the blends, and sometimes I won't because I might be in, I don't know, Japan or America or the Netherlands. But it's very much Mary's decision anyway. So as much as I can, I really like to be there for the base wine grading. And if I can be there for the blending, then I love it because it's so interesting. And I love to be, I love to watch it and to be involved in it. But sometimes it's not always possible. So I tend to at least, yeah.
Yeah, and is it always at the same time in the day?
We tend to do it in the morning, yeah, and we'll split it over lots of different days because you can't taste too many base wines in a row because the acidity is so high at that point. So we tend to probably taste maybe only about 15 wines a day max. And then we'll do it in the morning before lunch.
Yeah. And why is it so hard? Because the acidity is so high, but why is the acidity so high for the base wines?
Because they're naturally so high. And I think it's like, I suppose it's like if you were going to taste, I don't know, if you were going to sit down and taste 50 Shiraz from Australia, if you had one, then yes, you would think, okay, well, the tannin's quite a lot and the fruit profile's really intense and the alcohol's medium plus to high and that's lovely, la, la, la. And I think by the time you tasted 50 of them, your palate would be very tired and you wouldn't feel the nuances. And it's the same with these base wines. So, I mean, yes, we probably could taste 50 in a day, but I think by the time you get to the end of it, you've lost the ability to pick up those little things that make it different. And so that's why I think Mary made the decision that we would taste 15 a day. And I think that's a good number. And then that
Yeah,
allows us to
because
give full focus on those.
yeah, and so 15 is the magical number for tasting the base wines. But I also learned that during the second fermentation, the acidity level will lower because
Hmm.
of the second fermentation.
Yes, that's true as well. Yeah.
So so you're not tasting the same acidity level as I'm tasting now,
Yeah.
or as in the
Exactly.
bottle. It's much higher.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Shall I go to the Blanc
Please,
de
yes,
Noir?
Blanc de Noir. Yeah,
And
that's a great
is it
idea.
made of Pinot Noir and Meunier, or only Pinot
No,
Noir?
that's 100% Pinot Noir. Hmm. Yep.
It is a lovely color.
Yes. Yes, and that's 18, vintage 18 again as well, isn't it? Vintage 2018.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is it the same process as the Blanc de Blanc?
Broadly speaking, yeah, for sure. So again, we will isolate the Pinot Noir base wines that, I mean, when we think about Blanc de Blanc, we're thinking about precision and elegance and that salty minerality. And when we're thinking about Blanc de Noir, we're thinking about the intensity, the weight, the generosity, like the richness that we find in Pinot Noir. And I think we have to be very selective in terms of the base wines that make sense to go into Blanc de Noir. So yes, they need to have the red fruit, maybe stone fruit character, but also they need to have something a little bit darker, so blue fruits or something more spicy, something richer and fuller as well.
Yeah. I compared it in the nose
Hmm.
very, very fast. And
Yeah.
the Blanc de Blanc is for me like walking into a cookie factory. And
Hmm.
the Blanc de Noir is like walking into a forest. And a forest with a little bit of rain, with
Hmm.
wet leaves, uh, wet soil, and and in that way you get more in the Blanc de Noir. You have more spiciness, more uh, yeah, more warm characters,
Yeah.
and the Blanc de Blanc is more sweet characters, more roundness, more uh, like it's more like a happy place, and uh, the forest is like, okay, we're chilling, we're clearing our minds, uh, and it's more cozy.
Oh, that's a really nice way to describe them both.
Oh, thank you very much. And but also the spiciness give it more flexibility to serve it uh, during a meal.
Mm.
One of the questions I got on Instagram was from a friend of mine, Antonello Nicastri. He's working in at Hotel L'Europe as the head sommelier. He's the wine director there, and he's working mostly also on in Flore, the 2-star Michelin restaurant. And he asked me, okay, but can I serve it into the wine pairing? Can I serve it in my restaurant? What are the references in the world? So that's one question I got for you. Do you have experience working with Gusbourne, like Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir, or other wines in a Michelin star restaurant?
Yes, for sure. So, I mean, we work in the UK and in our export markets with lots of really amazing restaurants, and some are Michelin star restaurants. Some are, they don't have a Michelin star, but they are like wonderful restaurants anyway. And I think what's really wonderful about working with restaurants like that is the ability to have fun with matching these wines with food. And there's so much versatility when we think about sparkling wines and food, and especially these wines. Gusbourne wines are very food friendly because they have that structure, and perhaps a little bit more complexity and a bit more weight and generosity. And you know I love the Brut Reserve with pan-seared scallops, for example. And I love Blanc de Blanc with, I don't know, seafood with a lemon butter sauce, or I don't know. I mean, there's so much that we can do with all of them. And you're right, you know, the Blanc de Noir, because there's a bit more weight to it. I think we've had a lot of fun matching things like Wagyu steak with Blanc de Noir, because you've got the fattiness. We never really think perhaps about red meat and sparkling wines, but I think we should think about it more, because when you have that acidity, but also the weight and the generosity, and I think the textural element of bubbles and what that brings to the match, I think there's so much fun to be had with these wines and food. And, you know, I love to do wine dinners and to work with the chef and the sommelier and find some really exciting matches. So
Yeah, it's a very nice. It has a very nice backbone. I also think, okay, when you don't eat meat, like you're vegetarian or a
yes,
vegan, this could work very good with mushrooms, with
yes,
uh, with a vegan butter sauce,
hmm
some truffles on top. Oh,
yes,
it would be
yeah.
amazing.
And I've also had it recently with like roasted squash, and that works really
Oh,
beautifully too.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
roasted squash with thyme or something like
yeah,
that.
because squash, when you fry it a little bit or put it in the oven, you braise it a little bit, you get that caramelized character, make it more deep in flavors.
Exactly. Exactly. And exactly the same, you know, when you pan fry mushrooms and they get that caramelization. It's exactly that. And I think that works really well.
Oh, perfect.
Oh, you're
Shall I go
making me
to the
hungry.
last one?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay, let's stop about food. Let's go back to the wine. Uh,
No, don't worry. I love to talk about food. I love talking about food and wine. It's like my favorite thing to do. So,
we're going to the rosé. Ah, lovely color.
yes. This is the Rosé 2018 vintage as well. Um,
Yes.
and so our Rosé, it's always Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. But again, a bit like the Brut Reserve, the percentages of those varieties will change depending on the vintage and on the style of base wine that we had come through. And so in 2018, it was 59% Chardonnay, 23% Pinot Noir, and 18% Pinot Meunier. So again, quite dominated by Chardonnay. And the colour comes from the addition of about 5% of still red Pinot Noir that we barrel age and then we'll blend in to give the colour. And it also gives a bit more structure and a bit more weight as well.
So you always make a blend or assemblage of a rosé. You don't make a Sangnier rosé.
We don't. We did experiment with it actually in the earlier years of rosé. We looked at Sangnier, and then we decided that we preferred the blending method.
Again, it's a combination of the Blanc de Noir and the Brut Reserve, and with a gentle touch of the little cookie factory of the Blanc de Noir. It's a combination
Hmm
in the nose, because I haven't tasted yet. But how
Yeah.
do you make the blend for this? Because you have to have uh, a base wine of a red wine in it also. So you have to
Yes.
make several amounts of red wines for this also.
Yeah. So when we're blending for rosé, we'll blend the kind of core blend first. And, you know, again, we're looking for base wines which maybe have a little bit more fruit character, more leaning towards red fruits or stone fruits or kind of slightly spicy orange citrus, that kind of character. But something that feels really fruit driven, I think. And then once we have that, then we'll add in the still Pinot Noir, which is Pinot Noir that we set aside especially for rosé. Um, and it's interesting because it's always a balance, like as all these things are, you know, when you're balancing between having enough color, but the Pinot Noir will bring color, but it will also bring flavor and structure. So you add too much in, then it changes the structure too much. So that's, I think we generally feel kind of 4 to 5% ish is a nice amount.
Yeah. And it's not too much to add too much tannins, but the 5%, 4-5% adds a little bit of tannins also, because you have more tension on it, more tension in your mouth, more tension in the nose, and it's more a serious backbone, making it a better wine to end with this tasting also, and making it also more okay. This is what we could also do, because we're now tasting 4 different kind of wines from Gusbourne, but you make lots of more still wines, but also more sparkling wines. What is the main goal of the rosé? For the rosé, lots of people think, okay, rosé is for the summer. We don't need it in the spring or in the wintertime. But this wine is very has a lot of structure, is for all year. Is that the main goal? Making a rosé sparkling wine for all year?
I think the goal, it's an unintended consequence of the goal, for sure. I think the goal is to make a wine which, in its youth, yes, it has all of that vibrancy of red fruit character and a lovely kind of weight and generosity. And so it can be a perfect aperitif for a summer barbecue, for example, and believe me, it can be quite dangerous as such. But I think what's fascinating is, as you see this wine age as well, then it picks up more complexity. And it becomes more serious, and the Pinot within the blend becomes more savory. And so you get this kind of savory herbal note coming through. And, we were talking about food matching for wines. And I think food matching with this rosé is so special, because you can match it with a dessert that's not too sweet, maybe something that's a bit nutty or creamy or red fruit based. You can match it with meat, with vegetables, with seafood, with there's so much. I think it's a fascinating wine, and I always love watching the rosés age and seeing how they develop. So
yeah, you talk a lot about aging the wines. It's a very new perspective for lots of people, like using different kind of wine glasses also, because I'm using the same glasses now because I want to have the same experience every time. But if people have buying these kinds of wines, a lot of people think, okay, I have to buy this wine, I have to drink it straight away. But in your opinion, what do people have to know when they buy a bottle of Gusbourne?
I would say that if you want to buy it and drink it, then do. Absolutely, go ahead. But these wines will age as well, especially something like the Blanc de Blanc. I think of the 4 that we're tasting today, the Blanc de Blanc will probably age for the longest. But even so, the Brut Reserve or the Blanc de Blanc, the Blanc de Noir or the Rosé, you could easily put these wines into a cellar for 5 years or 5 to 10 years and see how they develop as well. So I think as these wines age, and I think as traditional method sparkling wines age generally, because of the acid profile, and because of the lees aging, they end up picking up much more of these, I guess, what we'd call tertiary or autolytic or toasted, yeasty, nutty, brioche complexity characters, which I think make the wine really interesting as well. And I do say that with some caution, because I know that some people love sparkling wine with more age, like 20 years age, and then some people don't, because as you age sparkling wines, then yes, they become more complex, but that really long-term aging will result in less bubbles, and of course a darker color and something that's more nutty and then isn't to everybody's taste. But I think in the short term, it's really interesting for everybody to experiment perhaps with aging sparkling wines.
Yeah, and that's why Gusbourne is in a big advantage, because the year of the vintage is on the bottle. When you pick up just any kind of bottle of sparkling wine, the vintage isn't on the bottle, so you don't know is it a blend, is it a vintage, because a lot of cuvées are also a vintage, but they
Yeah.
don't pronounce it on the bottle. And Gusbourne says it's on the bottle, so if you store it in your cellar, like 2019 or 2018, if you store it in your cellar, in 10 years, you still know, okay, it's 2019. And
Yes.
so my advice is to people, when you buy one bottle, don't buy only one bottle, buy 2 bottles, store one, keep patient, and drink one bottle and write
Yes.
something down. And after 5 or after 10 years, you grab the other bottle, you find out your notes. Okay, this was 5 or 10 years ago, and this time I think, okay, this time I found more wet leaves, more mushroom, more marzipan. The bubbles are less intense.
Mm-hmm.
That in that way you learn a lot, and you have a whole new experience. And I think
Agreed.
in 10 years, a bottle of even Gusbourne or other wine will be much less cheaper, let's say. The price will be higher. And if you buy it in 10 years, it's a good investment. It's a good investment of your experience, and also a good investment of your wallet.
It's
But
true.
talking about 10 years, uh, where do you see English wine go in 10 years?
Well, I think um, I can see only positive movement, and I'm really excited. It's great to see um, more producers looking to export wines. For example, we're seeing that. So hopefully, in Amsterdam and beyond, we will see more English producers, which I think is very exciting, because it helps to build, I think, an understanding of the category and what's happening. I think that still wines will increase. You look at all of the recent plantings in Essex, and a lot of those recent Essex plantings were for still wine production. That's quite exciting. And I think previously we've had, and we still do, have to be so site selective when we look at growing fruit for still wine, because of course, unlike traditional method sparkling wine, which welcomes that high acid, when you're looking at still wines, it's the opposite. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in Essex and other places for still wines over the next 10 years as well.
Yeah. And what do you think, will sparkling wines be the next like a disruptive drink from England?
Sorry.
Well, nowadays a lot of people think, okay, uh, uh, wines from England or from the UK are okay. It's a nice to have. They are there, but
Yes.
and like in the WSET courses, and also you have the Dutch equivalent of the WSET. It called SDEN.
Mm-hmm.
When you do it, the the biggest chunk of the lessons are France.
Yes.
Like for WSET, I
Mhm.
I did a WSET 3 course, and we got I think 2 or 3 days of France, and sometimes we get one day is South Africa, New Zealand, Australia in one time.
Yes.
But do you and the UK? Okay, they make wine there, but it's not in the WST course. Do you think in one day, maybe the WST courses or some other wine studies will be
Yeah.
3 days of wines from Great Britain?
Uh, um, well, I think that um, mhm, it's a really interesting question. Um, I think that we'll see a lot more happening over the coming decades in England and Wales, and I think it's going to be really interesting to watch it. And I think even if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years, and the improvements that have been made as well in terms of wine quality and what's happening in the vineyards, then I'm really excited for the future. I'm not sure if we'll get to a 3-day point with WSET lectures, but I do think that people are starting to take, they're starting to stand up and take notice of what's happening in the UK wine industry. And I think that's hugely exciting. So.
Very looking forward to that because we have a long wait ahead also. But I tasted 4 wines of Gusbourne today. But
Mhm.
what kind of sparkling wines Gusbourne also make?
Yes. So, yes, you've tasted our sort of core range, if you like. We also love to create smaller volume wines as well. And we released a very interesting wine recently, which was an oak reserve, which was a Blanc de Blanc that we aged entirely in oak, vinified entirely in oak, which was quite fun. We also have, of course, our prestige cuvée, 51 degrees north. Um, and the current vintage for that's 2016. And that's really a wine that celebrates absolutely what's possible in the UK if you're willing to take some risks and to be just so focused on making absolutely the very best wine that we can. And so that's what we do with 51 degrees north. It's Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, um, only from the best blocks, and we'll only make it in the best vintages as well. So there will be years that we know that we won't make 51 degrees north, but that's very exciting. And that wine just got named the world number 2 wine of the Wine Enthusiasts wine list of the year this year, which is amazing. It's the first time. I think it's their top 100, and it's the first time that an English wine has ever made it into Wine Enthusiast's top 100, which is really exciting. And
So the first time in top 100, and it is the second one.
yeah, we're number 2. Yeah,
You're
yeah.
number 2, but of a large competitions, nobody knows number 1 because number 1 is almost always One They Fly. The number 2 is everybody remembers that one.
Well, let's hope so.
So
Let's hope so.
yeah,
But
let's
it
hope
was the
so.
only English wine in there, and and it was the top sparkling wine of Wine Enthusiast of the world. And I think that's really, that's really exciting. So I think I can't wait to see that wine continue to develop. And you were talking about aging, and I can't wait to see that continue to age in bottle and in Magnum as well. So we'll see. Oh yeah, we do some Magnums. We have some fun with Magnums, which is lovely. It's a great format, and especially for aging. So yeah.
And in terms of sizes, you only make magnums, or do you also make other sizes?
No, I think for commercial purposes, magnums is as large as we get. So we have bottles, magnums, and some half bottles. So we bottled Brut Reserve in half bottles as well.
And the magnums, you do it all only for the Brut Reserve, or also for the Rosé, the Blanc de Blanc?
Yeah, so all of our core wines will bottle in Magnum as well. So the 4 that you tasted today we'll have in Magnum. 51 Degrees North in Magnum. Occasionally we've bottled still wines in Magnum as well, because that's quite fun, but not really for commercial release. And that's pretty much it. We work a lot with our late disgorged wines, which are wines which we've left on the lees for longer, so they've had longer time on lees, so more complexity. So the LD late disgorged range as well.
We'll have to find some bottles of the LD line also.
Yes.
Yeah. It's very diverse. I don't know if you mentioned, but how many hectares of vineyards do you have? Because you only make wines of your own vineyards, of your own
Yes.
fruit.
Yes. So we have 60 hectares in Kent, and we had 30 hectares in Sussex.
90 hectares.
Which sounds like a lot, but actually the vines are planted quite far apart. So we'll have 2 meters by 1 meter, really, because we need wide rows to stop shadow and to allow, enough airflow and air circulation as well. And also we keep our yields very low too. So, I mean, it sounds a lot, but the reality is it's not so much.
No. It sounds a lot, but the density of the vineyards are smaller because like in France, they use less space between every vine. So you have, in terms of vines, you have less vines per hectare.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and probably generally lower yields as well. So.
Because of you want to have more quality and not quantity.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Do you have any closing remarks or closing words for our audience?
Well, just to say that, I hope that you enjoy discovering Gusbourne, and if you've already discovered it, then hopefully you've enjoyed learning a little bit about us. If anyone's ever in the UK and you'd ever would like to visit, then, please feel free. It would be lovely to welcome people to the vineyard as well. It's lovely to chat and to be able to tell people, but I think there's something really special about standing in the vineyards and being there as well. So
I will put some links in the show notes to have contact with you and your colleagues, of course.
Yes.
Laura, thank you very much for your time. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks again for Vineyards for sending me these bottles, delivering these bottles. Rose, big shout out to Rose from Vineyards for delivering these bottles. This was a new episode of Sparks with VinoVonk. Laura, thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you next time on Sparks with VinoVonk.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.